Hello, and welcome to Recipes with Ben. If you're anything like me, I love homemade bread, but I've only made it a handful of times, so I feel like I'm a beginner at this point. And so, over the next series of videos, I'm going to test different variables and see how the end product turns out. So today's video, we're going to start with a thing called a Poolish, which is a type of pre-ferment that's 100% hydration that you make the night before, and then add that to the dough and make the bread like normal. So if you're interested in joining me on this journey, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future videos. With all that said, let's get started. Now, you may be asking yourself what exactly is a Poolish. And for me, what I found is an equal mixture of flour and water with a sprinkle of yeast that is said to make the bread softer and more fragrant and aromatic. I like to think of it in the same vein as when you make a yeast starter for brewing beer, so you can give the yeast a head start. For this recipe, I'm adding in 50 grams of water to 50 grams of flour, and then adding in a sprinkle of yeast into a plastic container, and then mixing that until the flour is fully hydrated, and let it sit out at room temperature for 24 hours before I start the next process of the bread making. Now I will say that because it's the dead of winter in my house, the room temperature is on the colder side, say around 66 degrees. And after doing some research, yeast may need a warmer temperature, say something about 80 degrees. So this Poolish shouldn't grow to say double in size overnight like it should have, but I'll try to tackle the issue in the future videos. So if you have any tips, please sure to leave them down below and I'll try them out in a future video. Now onto the bread dough. So I'm going to add 460 grams of bread flour to a large mixing bowl. Next step is going to be adding 11 grams of salt and follow that by 360 grams of water, making this a 70% hydration dough at this point. After giving the water a slight mix into the flour, I added all the Poolish to the dough and began mixing that together until it became shaggy. At this point, it was recommended that you wet both your hands while doing the kneading process so they don't stick to you. So I continued to knead all the flour until it was all completely hydrated, and then I did what was called a gluten rest, where I let this sit for 20 minutes, sealed. After that time, it was time for the good old stretch and fold to build up some gluten strength. So I wetted the hands I was working with and pulled the dough as far as it would stretch without breaking, and then folded it across the dough inside the bowl. I did this 3 more times for a total of 4 stretch and folds. And I grabbed one corner and folded it over itself and rotating it as it turned to start to form a ball. Then I pushed the underside and rotated that to make it taut, and I let that proof for another 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, the dough is much more elastic, and the stretches go a little bit further this time. So I repeated the same process before, so I started by wetting my hands, then did 4 stretch and folds, and then finally turned it into a ball. And I placed the lid back on top and let that ferment for 1 more hour. Now that it's been proofing for about 2 hours, this is what the bread looked like, so I'm going to move on to making the final shape. So in a heavily floured cutting board, I placed the dough on top of that, and I dusted the top of the dough with some more flour. Then I patted it flat down into a disc, making sure not to knock out all of the air. And then for this next part to kind of shape it, I'm going to pull from one corner outwards and giving it a good stretch, and then bringing it back in the center. And I did this about 5 total times. Then the next part to kind of seal it all in there is pull 2 opposite sides of the dough away from each other and meet them in the middle, and push that in the center. And I rotated 90 degrees and repeated it 1 more time. Then to shape it into a ball, I floured a pastry cutter and pushed it underneath the dough, sweeping it at a 90-degree turn as I was pulling it to kind of make the dough taut underneath. I did this several times to make tension with the dough until I was happy with the overall shape. Now, one suggestion I've seen if you don't have a proofing basket is to line a bowl with a small towel and cover that completely with flour and place the seam side up inside the bowl. So that's how I proceeded, and then I covered it again with the lid and allowed that to proof for 90 minutes. It's also important to note that at 60 minutes, I turned my oven on to 460 degrees Fahrenheit with the Dutch oven inside to allow it to preheat together. Now back to the dough after 90 minutes, I took it out of that bowl and placed a piece of parchment paper onto the surface in front of them. With the seam side down on the parchment paper, I used a large serrated knife and scored the bread, and then placed it inside that preheated Dutch oven. I didn't record this, but I sprayed water over the top of the dough before covering it and putting the lid on top, and then I baked it with the lid on top for 20 minutes. And after that time, this is what it looked like. So again, to kind of keep the hydration going, I sprayed it down again and allowed that to bake in the oven uncovered for an additional 30-ish minutes until it reached that desired color that I was looking for. I then removed the loaf from the Dutch oven, and you want to allow it to cool for at least 2 hours before cutting into it, but I like to check at this point to see if it's done by tapping the bottom of the bread, and I always get a nice hollow sound saying that the interior is completely cooked. And the exterior at this point had a lovely golden, in some places, to brown in other places, but wasn't burnt. So the last thing to do is to see that interior crumb shot by slicing in half perpendicular to where I scored it. And what you can see is there are some irregular holes, and the loaf is kind of dense in the middle, but the flavor all was pretty good, but not perfect. I think, honestly, the big thing I would do with this one is add a touch more salt, but it's not bad for the first try. I do think that the proofing is definitely the thing that needs to be improved, so maybe I'll try that out in a future video. With all that said, thank you so much for watching, and make sure you subscribe to see what's next in this journey into making excellent bread. Feel free to leave any tips down below that you have, and I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I'll see you again soon.